On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union finally came crashing down. The Soviet upper chamber officially voted the Soviet Union out of existence, immediately creating 15 independent countries. The Cold War was over, but the end had been coming ever since the mid-1980s. The Cold War had taken its toll, and the Soviet economy had stagnated, leading to mass protests for reform and independence throughout the USSR. Since then, most of the former Soviet countries have struggled to find their way in the democratic free market system, with only a few nations being able to adapt to life after communism. Despite the dissolution of the USSR, Russian President Vladimir Putin has made it clear that he wants to expand the Russian Empire. Whether this means reuniting the former Soviet countries into one union again is unclear. However, the world has been watching Russia's movements carefully and anxiously. Some have thus asked the question, what if the Soviet Union reunited? What if the original members of the Soviet Union got together again to form a united political and economic union? Would they be better or worse off? Well, the first point to address is simply, why? Why would former Soviet countries want to reunite? It's highly unlikely that everyone shares the same vision as the Russian president to come together in order to create a formidable Russian empire. The reunification would have to benefit everyone involved, economically, politically, and socially. If the 15 former Soviet nations could be convinced that forming a new union would ultimately bolster their economies and improve the lives of their citizens, it may pique their interest. However, if the goal was to embark on an authoritarian and myopic return to yesteryear, it's very doubtful if many countries would want to join in. Democratic nations that have successfully diversified their economies, like Lithuania and Latvia, have too much to lose if the nation isn't a progressive one. Another motivation for Soviet reunification could be for the cultural and social benefits that it might offer. There's a diverse mix of cultures and histories among the former Soviet states. Multiculturalism brings creativity, new ideas, and innovation. This is exactly what much of the former Soviet Union needs. If a reunited union was modeled on something similar such as the EU, citizens could benefit from being able to travel, work, and study freely throughout the union. This would create job growth and encourage more opportunities. If a civil engineer in Estonia couldn't find work, but Uzbekistan was crying out for that kind of work, it would be mutually beneficial. This has proven to work with the European Union. Citizens of the EU have the right to study, live, and work anywhere within the EU, which spreads skills and talents throughout the region. Furthermore, the next thing to clear up with this hypothetical is to forget about another communist Soviet Union. A communist-style government would no longer be able to effectively manage such a huge population of people from mixed backgrounds, cultures, and political leanings. Nor would it be able to rearrange and coordinate the economy to suit global capitalism. Citizens of the former Soviet countries have had too long to experience the freedom of democracies and opportunities of the free market system. They would plausibly refuse to take huge steps backward and would simply up and leave. So let's scratch that possibility. If the Soviet Union were to reunite, it would have to embrace capitalism and the free market. What would happen then if the former Soviet countries united but remained committed to market economies? Here are the basic facts. If the 15 countries were to reunite, the Soviet Union Part II population would be around 300 million people. This would make it one of the world's most populated countries, up there with the US, which currently sits at around 330 million. Much of the growth would come from the regions in Central Asia, which have high fertility rates and younger populations than other ex-Soviet countries to the north. So far, so good. Now for the big ones, GDP and industry. For the time being, we're going to focus on the current GDP per capita for each country, as opposed to the annual GDP of the nation. A country could have a high overall GDP output, but may still struggle to distribute the wealth evenly amongst its population. GDP per capita gives us a more accurate idea of a nation's economic progress. The combined average GDP per capita of the former Soviet countries is roughly $11,000. Lithuania has the biggest GDP per capita of the former Soviet countries. In 2023, the average GDP per person was around $28,000. Latvia is next at $21,000 per capita. At the other end of the spectrum are countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which struggle to make even $2,000 per capita. You probably don't need me to tell you this isn't great. A GDP per capita of just $11,000 would put the Soviet Union at number 70 in the world, alongside Serbia and Mauritius. Clearly, there's work to be done. Which brings us to industry. What can the former Soviet countries bring to the table in terms of economic output? We'll look at sectors that are currently doing well. sectors that could be improved on, and possibilities that are yet to be tapped into. One of the first things that comes to mind when thinking of Soviet countries is natural resources. Russia, in particular, produces massive amounts of revenue based on its fuel and energy industries. It's the world's second biggest producer of natural gas, behind the US, and one of the biggest exporters of oil. Despite the region's low level of economic development, Central Asia is similarly blessed with an abundance of riches. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan are all sitting on huge reserves of oil and natural gas. Kazakhstan has the world's largest uranium supply, and Tajikistan is mineral-rich, with healthy supplies of gold, silver, lead, and zinc, to name a few. Countries with mid-level GDP per capita, such as Estonia and Belarus, have built up strong manufacturing sectors. Like most other countries from the Soviet era, the next step is to start modernizing their economies by developing their service sectors and branching out into tech and clean energy industries. The more developed Soviet countries, such as Lithuania and Latvia, they're on the right path. Both have built diversified economies built around manufacturing and service industries such as IT, finance, chemical production, and petroleum refining. However, Lithuania and Latvia are in the minority. Both have democratically elected governments, which are generally more likely to produce healthy economies. A democratic government is more open to reforms more often and spends more money on healthcare and education, creating more skilled workers. This, in turn, attracts more foreign investment, creating a prosperous cycle. On the other hand, authoritarian governments are less open to reforms, even if they're necessary. There's also a higher chance of corruption and misspent revenue, which also limits the chances of luring investors. The majority of Soviet unions have been hampered by such government, at least formerly. And this is the biggest obstacle to Soviet reunification. As much as the people may want democratic change, the powers that be have to sign off on it. But let's go with the hypothetical and imagine that all former Soviet countries want a democratized union. Now we might be getting somewhere. If that were to happen, foreign investment would surge, particularly given the region's healthy population and abundance of resources. Most economies would need a complete overhaul. Too many former Soviet nations are reliant on agriculture and manufacturing. These are the sectors that typically resemble the progress of developing countries. First, an agricultural-focused economy leads to greater urbanization and the growth of manufacturing. From there, it's essential to start focusing on more skills-dependent industries such as service and high-tech. Finance, healthcare, information technology, education, and advanced manufacturing are the sectors that the old Soviet states should be looking at. None of this will happen overnight, but if all nations are on the same page and working towards a common goal, it could certainly be achieved. Which brings us to the final question. What's the likelihood of this actually happening? Well, it would all hinge on whether countries under authoritarian rule could transform into democracies. And that can only happen if the weight of public pressure is so great that the governments have no choice but to stand down. Of course, there's no easy task there, and it can be a dangerous proposition considering authoritarian regimes control a nation's military. But if neighboring states with democratic governments are seen to be enjoying the perks of free trade agreements and increased investment, people living under dictatorships might decide that, hey, it's time for a change. In cases such as Russia, it may be a more likely option to simply let the clock tick before administrative change. After all, nobody can live forever. Yet. So, can the Soviet Union reunite? In the near future, it would seem to be unlikely. However, one day and with the right intentions, what do you think?